Alright, 1856. Do that little rearranging thing because I'm not professional. So in some ways this was really a funny playthrough. My last couple have been. This is, in general, one of the shorter 18xx games anyhow. It runs, at least of the ones that I'm used to. I know there are, out of sort of the published by big companies, the Mayfair, the Avalon Hill, certainly shorter than the old 1829s. Oh God, those were long. But what we saw was an incredibly short game. What's funny here is probably 80 to 90% of my opposed games ended kind of like this, just because we had one person who just could not get how to survive in 1856. We'd have newer players come in and sit down at the table and play very cautiously, and of course they survive. But you can't play very cautiously and try to win this game. And that's kind of the knife edge here. I'm still sitting back and saying, wow, I'm not entirely sure what I did wrong. How did that happen? Which is very much the feeling the player who always suffered this had. He'd try something new, he'd try something new, he'd try something new, and it just never quite worked. Whereas the couple of the rest of us who kind of got the game would play a very similar game all the time. But that similar game doesn't always work. One of the things that you want to look at with this game is it is this delicate knife edge. People who know what they're doing in an XX game may well crash it. There is this real strong division. You have so many little levers to play with and so many places to go very wrong that there is this strong possibility that the early part of the game will end the game. That somebody will, even if they're not bankrupted, at least get knocked out during that early stages. Especially in the 6-player game. I think if you play this with less than 6, that becomes less and less likely. Because you have more money to put into your companies thus just become stronger. Maybe in a 3-player game you try running 2 companies real early, but that doesn't really tend to work. So what this managed to do was to highlight how variable a game of 56 can really be. You could be stepping into this game and playing something that just takes a couple of hours and favors the player who plays the most cautiously. You could see a surprise winner because everybody's assuming it's going to go long. Alternatively, though, if the other players all play cautiously, the guy who takes the risk is just going to blow them away because he is not going to fall on his face. He's going to be making the money big time, whereas the cautious players are probably going to be safe enough that they can absorb the losses over the course of the game. There's also a question of what is cautious. Because if you don't take loans, you may find yourself outstripped. This is, again, out of sort of those high print run games, I think the one where the trains push out the most quickly, the most often. At least that's what I've found. It's because of the availability of these loans, right? If the guy with the CPR had been able to hold 3-2 trains and run them for a while, it'd be great. It's not such a good idea, though, to be holding such a weakened company as you get close to that 4 train. So you really do see wilder swings in this game than you see in any of the other XX games that are sort of part of the normal coda. Leaving out the deep thought games, I've heard some of them are very, very, tightly wound, where they can just go springing off into nowhere. J.C. Lawrence mentioned one where the game ends generally in the first operating round. Wow, that's some pretty hefty juggling going on in the very early stages of the game. So what this requires is a more flexible kind of play. And usually when I sit down and play a solitaire game, and that's why I'm kind of glad this crashed so quickly, usually when I sit down and play a solitaire game of XX, I play more or less the way I play, which is this kind of balanced and flexible position that I guess maybe ends up working very well towards, oh man, I better not buy 3 of those 2 trains. That's a little too risky. Let's just buy 2, make as heavy a money as we can, and see what the other players do. Just taking things more cautiously quite often keeps everybody kind of in the game and keeps it very balanced. But if somebody tries to go harder in the direction of making lots of money when everybody's trying to burn through the money, trying to burn through the trains at a fairly high pace, everybody's expecting that, I don't think that works. So you've got kind of this balance. You can't go too far in that direction if other people are going in that direction. But if you don't go in that direction, if you play cautiously and no one takes it off the rails and no one drives themselves into bankruptcy, you're going to see yourself kind of fall behind. So maintaining this kind of flexible balance, trying to keep an eye on what the game is, but remembering the money's not open in this one. The money's very not open in this one, to the extent that there's actually hidden money transfers when you buy a train. Most of the games, all the information is open, so you can make the argument that, okay, well, nothing precludes me from keeping score on paper and keeping track of what every single transaction is, so the money is essentially open. Now, you want to spend time waiting for me to write all these things down, or are we just going to play with open money? Well, the spirit of 1830 states that the money's hidden, but all the transfers are open. So you can kind of make that argument, but you're kind of breaking the spirit of what the rules intend. Hey, that's fine, whatever. You know, you're adding something to the rules in tracking the money and then playing it open. Something that I believe hurts the game. But in this particular game, you do have hidden money no matter what. Of course, this game, it hadn't come into play yet, which is to say if people were tracking money, the money could be kept open at the point that it was. So people could have been pretty sure that he's not going to survive that, or he has the option not to survive that, because that's really what happened here. The player who went bankrupt could have survived it if he wanted to come in last 2 or 3 hours later in a 4 or 5 hour game. I'm assuming this probably takes, I remember it always being one of the shorter XXs. I think it keeps under 6 hours usually. And that's a nice feature to it. That's one of the things that makes it more pleasant for me solo, because it doesn't go into that long period where you're just running and running and running. What's unfortunate, though, about my playthrough is that we didn't get to see things like the CGR forming. We didn't get to see the jockeying around that, whether or not you want to pay off your loans. And that's another point where the game can break. What we saw here was really rare, in my opinion. In my solo games, I never see that. In opposed games, I've seen it and kind of shook my head and said, how did you manage that? Well, now we see how. Buying too many trains early on can put you in the position where you're going to crash hard. But there usually is some risk of someone paying off all their loans in that stage where you're getting to the CGR, not having enough money for a permanent train, not falling into the CGR. You fall into the CGR, you're protected. The CGR does not run like a normal corporation. It's almost guaranteed. I mean, you're not going to go bankrupt on the CGR is basically the thing. It's going to end up with the cash and the power to be able, even without loans, to position itself so that it has some survivability. Even if it's only one company going into it. You may end up with a weak little CGR, but it's still not going to crush you out of the game. I don't believe it's like the Prussian, though. I don't think it can borrow a train. But it's not allowed to run for cash. It's not allowed to pay out until it gets a permanent train. Which means you can't do the kinds of things that make you end up crashing, which is trying to make a lot of money real quick and hawking your future, essentially. Let's see if it is. I don't think it has any train borrowing or anything like that. No, it doesn't look like it. What it does have is those extra shares that'll be sold and they go directly into the company treasury. So it does have room for additional money. It's very hard. I have never seen somebody go bankrupt on the CGR. Let's put it that way. Of course, I haven't played all that much. So that's sort of your next point at a bankruptcy. After the CGR forms, everybody's kind of got, after you get past that point, everybody's kind of got their permanent trains at that point. It's possible you could see a dump of a company that hands off a terrible position and crashes someone, but it's probably not going to bankrupt them. They have enough money and stock portfolio to be able to pay things out. We didn't see the reduction in the certificate limit that can come, or the increase in the certificate limit that can come, based on what the results of that CGR coming out are. We didn't see the shift in companies floating, where now they float and they get all the money that they're ever going to get all at once. That's always an interesting point when that changes, where you're sitting there with, oh, I could buy this company, start it with a 5 train, and then I'll be getting money as each certificate's bought. Or I could delay that, and maybe I have to pay out of pocket for that 5 train, by the way. Maybe I could delay that, or take loans out, because they still exist at that point. Maybe I can delay that purchase until the 6 train is out, and then I get all my money and I can buy a big permanent train right off the bat. So there's kind of that kind of decision making going in there. So there are a lot of interesting points to this game. There's a lot of richness coming in the later game that we just didn't see. New differences, changes from the 1830 experience. But if you sit down with a bunch of new players to 1856 who aren't used to other games where the trains all pop out, I bet you at least one person's going to screw up mightily, like I did here. Well, maybe not. The first time we played 1856, nobody did. Everybody was a little bit more cautious. Everybody was a little more worried about loans. The second time, hey, it was clear loans were a good thing. It was actually, I think one player kind of ran the table on the first game. He came to the conclusion that loans look great. Look at the money I'm going to make. And they worked really well for him. By the second time, we all realized you need some loans. You're not going to make this playing cautiously here. You can't just take out 1 or 2 loans to get you over a kind of rough spot. and maybe get you a little bit of extra income. You need to run as hard as you can without endangering yourself. And the knife edge is the endangering yourself. So for this, out of the 18xx games I have, this is the one that provides that most delicately balanced decision making, hardest to kind of judge how much risk you can take. I like a lot of the toys and features in 1861. I also really like the stolidity of 1830. Okay, 1830 isn't as dry and stolid as, say, 1829 or 1853 or, God, worst of all, maybe 1835, where companies don't change hands. It really comes down to trying to maneuver other people's interests so that you get something good out of it, out of the way the stocks are going to fall. That's a really weird game to play for me. That's always a part of an XX, but that seems to be the majority of 1835, is trying to control the situation so that you get the nice shares that are out there. Or the shares that will be nice. You also have to assess the situation. It's much more about the long-term shareholdings than about this rape and dump type game. And that's really what I don't like about 35. It just doesn't appeal to me, but I can see the game there. I can see what is interesting to people. I just don't like it much. 56 is sort of the opposite side of it. It is this incredibly volatile situation where you don't know what's going to happen, where you can look at a company and say, I don't think that's going to be dumped on me, and then it is anyway. It's very hard to judge how bad off that company is, from my standpoint at least. I looked at it and said, yeah, it's worth having a second share of that thing. That's going to make me lots of money. No, it wasn't. That thing was sick at that point, and that's what I realized when I got to the stock round is, I don't want this. I can do better with something else. Well, maybe not, because by handing it off to someone else, I crashed them. I gave them good reason to end the game, and they were in less of a position to save it than the person who originally owned it, and I was starting a new company. If I hadn't started that new company, things might have come out of play differently. The whole pace might have been different. Maybe that 4 train doesn't come out as quickly as it did. And instead, I'm kind of losing my train of thought here, I fear. It might have been a good move to be holding those stocks. They might have run better. They might have been a better position. So it's just this really, really tangled web of your actions. If you sell, if you dump that thing, you're hurting the other player, but only because of the other actions that came from the dump. You're hurting that other player so much that the new company you start doesn't fulfill its promises to you. You may have been better off buying. So what my thought was, you may have been better off buying additional shares as an investor, and just saying, I'm not going to take risk. I'm going to buy things that are going to make me money straight through, and I'm going to be comfortable there. Well, had he done that, he might not have crashed the CPR. And he might have left the CPR in a stable enough situation that it would have time to recover. It only needed a little bit more time to recover with that huge payout. It could have bought the first 4 train. It just needed 2 slots. 2 trains got purchased before it did, of the 4 variety. It's just this really, really hard to dissect You can do it in the post-mortem, but when you're sitting there in the moment, I want another company. Yeah, follow these general rules. General rules don't necessarily take you through 56 as well as they do, say, in 1830. 1830, you would make that move. You'd hand off a company because you decide it's it's more of a liability than a value, and you start your new company. Or you can look at it and say it's definitely a liability. I don't want to take the penalty for the other company because I think I just crashed this guy. But in this case, the balance seems finer. It's harder to tell exactly what you're doing to someone. Anyway, it's for that volatility that I really do like this game, but it's hard for me to say it is the game I like best because there is something disappointing when it kind of crashes early like this, when you miss 2/3 of the game, essentially. Makes you want to play it again. Too bad my time schedule doesn't allow that. 61. I wanted to touch on that a little bit because I've only played that once. It has lots of toys, lots of little things to fiddle with. And they're all integrated nicely. But maybe it feels a little overblown. It's hard to tell. I have to play it again to be sure. And that's my worry with it is I love all those little toys that you get to play with. I feel like you have almost as many little toys in this one to play with. But you also have this volatility in it, which is kind of questionable plus minus. And you've got to compare that to kind of the cleaner lines of an 1830, where you really, it's not stripped down, but it is the basis for all these other kind of more cruel versions of 18XX. There's the other line that's kind of less cruel, which is the 1829 line, the 1853. And those are just a different kind of game. They feel more like 35 does in the sense that you're not really trying to juggle the trains as much and force the game into a certain pattern through the trains, through crashing companies on people. Your stocks aren't as volatile. You're not looking as much with the manipulation of the stock market and the stock holdings. And that's, it's just a different kind of game. And it's one that, when I picked up 30, the thing that really snapped for me was, oh man, this is really a cruel game. You can trash somebody in this game so badly if they make a mistake. And then you learn how to avoid being trashed. 56? Takes it to another level in difficulty. It's a little harder to keep yourself from crashing. All right, let's send it up.